the alien princess waited among ruins, until a human returned through fire. The ruins stretched across the horizon like the skeleton of a civilization too proud to die quietly, jagged towers reaching to a sky that no longer answered with warmth, streets filled with ash and silence, and echoes of battles that had torn the very foundations of a once mighty empire apart. And among those ruins, in the shattered heart of what had once been her throne city, the alien princess waited, draped in the tattered remnants of ceremonial robes that had once symbolized lineage and divinity but now clung to her shoulders like the last fragile veil of dignity against a world that had burned everything she had ever known, her eyes luminous in the gloom, sharp with grief, hunger, and endurance, her body weakened from too many days surviving on scraps among broken palaces that had once glimmered with crystal lights and soaring banners of her people. And yet she waited because waiting was all she had left, waiting for the impossible, waiting for someone who had promised in the chaos of fire and retreat that he would return for her, waiting for a human whose presence had been as unlikely as it was transformative, waiting through the endless cycles of a burned world because in the darkness of despair she had clung to the single thread of his words, his gaze, his defiance of her captors, and though every rational part of her mind told her he could not have survived the inferno that had consumed the city when the armadas of warlords descended, she refused to let the last ember of hope go out, because if she let that flame die then she would be nothing more than a ghost haunting ruins that no one remembered. She had once been a princess of galaxies, her people stretching across star systems, her throne room filled with envoys, ministers, and generals who bent their heads to her wisdom, and the histories sang of her ancestors who carved worlds into gardens and built bridges across stars. But now she sat among the charred stones of a broken empire, her bare feet cut by shards of shattered murals depicting her lineage, her lips cracked from thirst, her voice seldom used because no one remained to hear. Her only companions the ghosts of her people's laughter, the cries of the children who had once danced in marble courtyards, and the songs of the soldiers who had sworn oaths to her that they would never leave her unprotected, oaths broken by fleets of enemy ships that rained fire without pause until the skies themselves seemed aflame, until the grand towers folded like paper, until the streets melted into rivers of molten stone, until she, the daughter of dynasties, was dragged from her throne by her own bodyguards and cast into hidden passages beneath the palace, screaming not to be abandoned, clawing at the air as they left her there, locked in shadows while the city above drowned in fire, and when she crawled out days later, her people were gone, the city hollowed, and she had been alone ever since. Alone, except for the memory of him, the human who should never have been there, a stranger in her court when diplomacy still had meaning, sent as an envoy of a species dismissed by her ministers as too young, too brash, too untested among the older civilizations to matter in the tides of war, but he had stood taller than most of them, not in stature but in resolve, a man with eyes that carried storms and a voice that carried truths that no one wanted to hear, warning them of betrayals that came true, warning them that the warlords were not to be appeased, that fire was their only language, that submission would bring only chains, and while the elders scoffed, she had listened, curious about this human who seemed carved from iron and fire, and in him she had seen not just a voice of warning but a soul that burned with something her own people had lost, a will unbent by despair, a defiance that seemed to draw strength from the very idea of being outnumbered. And when the fire came, when the fleets tore her world apart, it had been him who fought his way through collapsing halls, carrying a weapon too crude by her people's standards but wielding it with a fury that made it something greater, protecting her when even her generals had fallen silent, standing at her side when the skies turned red, and when the palace finally crumbled, he had looked at her, his face bloodied, his uniform scorched, and he had promised, in a voice she could never forget, "I'll come back for you." She had wanted to scream at him then, wanted to demand he stay, wanted to cling to him and never let him vanish into the chaos, but the fire had torn them apart, and when the smoke cleared he was gone. That was months ago or perhaps years. The ruins bent time into something unmeasurable, days bled into nights, nights into days, and she marked her survival only by the slow crumbling of her robes, the deepening hollows beneath her eyes, and the ache in her heart that refused to die. Others would have left, would have searched for refuge in the mountains or tried to barter themselves to the conquering warlords for mercy, but she was a princess still, and a princess did not beg, did not crawl, did not trade her name for scraps. A princess waited. And so she waited, her mind wandering through memories of what had been, dreams of what could be, fears of what awaited her if she was wrong, if the human who had looked into her eyes and promised his return had perished in the fires, if she had been left behind like everything else her world had abandoned. The wind sang through broken archways, carrying the scent of ash and the faint tang of metal, and sometimes in the dead of night she thought she heard footsteps, the crunch of boots across rubble, and she would rise, her heart hammering, whispering his name into the dark, but it was always only the ruins shifting, the bones of her world settling deeper into silence. Still, she did not leave because leaving would mean surrender, leaving would mean that hope had died, and she would rather starve among ruins than kill the last flame burning in her chest. And then, one night when the fires of memory had nearly drowned her in despair, when she had almost allowed herself to think that perhaps she had waited in vain, she saw it, a light cutting through the ash-filled horizon, not the cruel light of enemy warships, not the burning trail of weapons, but a steady glow, deliberate and purposeful, slicing through the night sky, descending toward the ruins as though the stars themselves had bent down to touch her world, and in that light her heart leapt. Because though she had no proof, though her mind screamed it could be anything, her soul told her that it was him, the human, the one who had promised, the one who had carried her through fire once and had sworn to do so again, and suddenly every cut on her feet, every ache in her body, every hunger that had gnawed at her was forgotten, and she stumbled through the ruins toward the landing site, her eyes burning with tears she had not shed in months, whispering his name again and again as if saying it could summon him into existence. And as the light grew brighter and the rubble shook with the tremor of engines, she realized that waiting had not been for nothing, that hope had not been a fool's dream, and that perhaps, just perhaps, the impossible had returned through fire to find her. The ground trembled beneath her bare feet as the great shape descended through the choking clouds of ash. The shriek of engines echoing through the hollow bones of her city until fragments of shattered glass and broken stone fell in shivers from leaning towers, and the alien princess staggered forward, clutching at the remnants of a wall for balance, her heart hammering in her chest because every instinct warned her that no ship came to this place except to strip what little life remained, yet hope, fragile and bright, pushed her legs onward even as reason whispered it could not be him, that the human she had clung to in memory was dust scattered to the stars, that this was only another cruelty in a world that had grown cold. But when the vessel broke through the black smoke she saw its markings, she saw the steel lines of human craft, not elegant like her people's ships, not vast and merciless like the warlord's dreadnoughts, but strong, sharp, functional, a shape meant to endure fire and carry souls into the abyss without bending, and her breath caught in her throat as tears blurred her vision, because only humans dared fly so boldly into death, and only one human had ever sworn to her that he would return through fire, and though she had forgotten the taste of food and the sound of music she could not forget his voice, those words carved into her bones, and now the impossible seemed to rise from the ruin before her eyes. The ship landed with a grinding roar, scattering dust in a wave that made her cough, her thin frame racked by the effort, but she pressed forward, stumbling over debris until she reached the plaza where her people's statues once stood, now reduced to cracked torsos and broken faces, and there, at the center of ruin, the vessel's ramp began to lower with a hiss of steam and hydraulics, a sound so loud in the silence of years that she felt her knees weaken as though the universe itself had opened, and then she saw him, his silhouette framed by light, broad shoulders straight though his uniform was torn, a weapon slung across his back, his stride steady as if the fires of war had not burned him down but forged him stronger, and in that moment the world ceased to matter, the ruins melted from her sight, and all she saw was the human who had promised, the human who had returned. Her lips formed his name but no sound came, only a choked gasp, her throat too dry from months of silence to give voice, but he heard her anyway, his eyes locking on hers across the ruins, and his pace quickened until he was running, leaping over broken stone, pushing through dust, and then his arms were around her, strong, real, the heat of life searing through her cold skin, and she collapsed against him, sobbing, her body trembling with the release of hope that had nearly broken, her tears darkening the dirt on his chest as his hand cradled the back of her head, his voice whispering, steady and certain, "I told you I'd come back." She could not answer, not at first, her voice lost in the storm of emotion, but she clung to him as if letting go would mean waking from a dream, and slowly, through cracked lips, she managed to whisper, "I waited," and he drew back just enough to look at her, his eyes filled with fire and sorrow, taking in her frailty, the hollows of her cheeks, the dirt streaking her face, and guilt flashed across his features though his jaw tightened with resolve, and he lifted her as though she weighed nothing, carrying her up the ramp into the vessel as though the ruins might try to drag her back if he left her standing in their grasp. Inside the ship, warmth and filtered air struck her like a tide, clean, breathable, filled with the hum of human machines, and for the first time in what felt like eternity she felt sheltered, no longer exposed to the endless night of her dead world, but her mind spun with disbelief, with questions, with fear of what had brought him back here, into this graveyard where no sane soul dared tread, and though she wanted to speak them, to demand answers, she could only cling to the reality of him. The steady beat of his heart against her ear, the warmth of his arms, the undeniable truth that he had returned when even her own people had abandoned her. He set her gently onto a padded bench and retrieved water, pressing the canister to her lips with such care that she nearly wept again, and the taste of it was like liquid fire and light, clean and cool against her cracked throat, each swallow a reminder of life returning to her body, and as she drank, his eyes never left her, burning with both relief and fury, as if the sight of her suffering was a wound he could never forgive himself for, and when she finally drew breath, she tried to speak. But only a whisper escaped. "You came, why?" He smiled then, though it was a smile laced with pain, and he said, "Because I promised and because they thought they could chain you to these ruins, but I will not let them write your end here." She wanted to protest, to tell him it was impossible, that the warlord still controlled the skies, that the ruins were haunted by patrols that would hunt them, but the strength in his voice stilled her doubts, because this was the human she had first seen standing defiant in her court. This was the human who had looked at her empire's arrogance and spoken truth, and this was the human who had fought through fire once before when no one else dared, and so she let silence fall, trusting him as she had trusted no one else. He explained then, in quick, clipped tones, that he had fought his way through the blockade, that his ship bore scars from battles she could not imagine, that the warlords believed her long dead and thus left the ruins unguarded except for scavenger patrols, and that he had returned because her life mattered, not only to him but to what remained of humanity, because she was more than a princess in ruins, she was a symbol of resistance, proof that not all who fell to fire had been extinguished, and if she could live, if she could rise again, then so too could those who still fought in the shadows of empires. His words stunned her because she had thought herself forgotten, a relic entombed in stone, yet here was this man telling her she was hope itself, and though she wanted to reject it, to tell him she was too broken to be anything more, she saw in his eyes that refusal was useless, because to him she had already become something greater than despair, something worth returning through fire to save. Yet even as hope stirred within her chest, the sound of alarms pierced the air, sharp and urgent, and his expression hardened as he moved to the console, scanning readings before cursing under his breath, telling her that enemy patrols had detected the landing, that they had minutes at best before the skies rained fire once more, and she felt terror coil in her stomach, the same terror she had felt the day her world fell, but this time she was not alone, this time the human stood at her side. His voice steady as he said, "We'll make it out. I didn't come this far to lose you now." The ship shook as engines roared to life, lifting from the plaza, dust billowing below, ruins shrinking beneath them, and through the small viewport she saw the horizon light with distant streaks of fire as patrol craft moved to intercept, yet she did not collapse into despair, because she remembered his words, remembered the strength of his arms, remembered that when the world burned he had fought through it, and as the first explosions flared in the sky, she whispered, steady and certain, "Then I will not let them take me again," and though she was weak, though she was scarred by hunger and grief, she rose, standing beside him at the console, her hand brushing his as if to anchor herself to his strength, and in that moment she understood that the waiting was over, that hope was no longer a flame barely kept alive but a fire ready to burn, and that together, through fire and ruin, they would defy the galaxy once more. The ship tore through the ash-laden sky, its engines screaming as though straining against the weight of the entire dead world, the hull rattling with every gust of heated wind and every burst of distant fire, and the alien princess braced herself against the console while the human worked the controls with a steady intensity, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the readings, his every movement purposeful, as if he had already fought this battle 100 times in his mind, and she could only marvel at how unshaken he seemed in the face of such overwhelming danger, because outside the viewport the patrol craft were closing in, sleek black silhouettes cutting across the horizon like blades of shadow, their weapons glowing as they locked onto their target, and for a heartbeat fear clawed at her chest, the old fear of fire raining down upon her home, of skies splitting open, of screams swallowed by smoke, yet when she turned to look at him she found her courage again because though his ship was outnumbered, though its hull bore scars and its systems screamed warnings, he had not come through fire to surrender now, and she could see in him the unyielding defiance that had first set him apart from all others, a defiance that even ruin could not break. The first barrage struck, shaking the vessel so violently that she stumbled, but he caught her with one hand, steadying her without taking his eyes from the console, his voice calm even as alarms wailed, "Hold on. They won't take us. Not today." She clung to his arm, feeling the strength beneath the worn fabric, and she whispered, almost to herself, "Not today," as though repeating his words could make them law, and then the ship dived, engines roaring as he swung them into a maneuver so daring she thought the hull would split apart, fire streaking past as enemy bolts missed by a breath, and she realized then that he was not simply fleeing, he was fighting, every motion calculated not just for survival but to strike back, to show them that even hunted, even scarred, he would not bow. The enemy pressed harder, their formation tightening, trying to corner them against the high ridges that rose from the scorched earth, jagged like teeth, and she felt despair flicker. But then he grinned, a fierce and almost reckless grin, and slammed the controls forward, plunging the ship into the narrow canyons where the ruins of mountains hid them from scanners, weaving between stone spires with impossible precision, engines howling as the vessel scraped so close she swore she could reach out and touch the rock, and the patrol craft followed, less skilled, less desperate, and one by one the canyon claimed them, fire blooming behind as ships crashed against walls they could not outfly, until only a handful remained, circling above, waiting to strike when the human emerged. She caught her breath, trembling with the realization that he was not just surviving, he was carving a path, and in his hands the battered ship seemed alive, each movement an act of defiance, each risk an oath that they would not die here, not when he had returned through fire to bring her from the ruins, not when she had finally found him again after so long. But even his skill could not erase the truth. The blockade still lingered above, fleets of enemy craft waiting to incinerate anything that dared leave the poisoned atmosphere, and as they rose higher, the smoke thinning to reveal the distant glint of warships, her chest tightened with dread, because she had seen before what it meant to stand against such power, she had seen entire cities turn to ash in the face of their guns, and she could not bear the thought of him meeting the same fate for her sake. "There are too many," she whispered, her voice breaking, but he shook his head, eyes fierce, and said, "There are never too many if even one still fights." His words struck her like a blade and a bomb, cutting through her despair, igniting something within her that had long since grown cold, and she realized then that he was not just fighting for her life, he was fighting for what she represented, for hope, for defiance, for the belief that even the smallest flame could defy the darkness, and that flame now burned in her chest, hot and steady, and she would not let it die. The blockade drew closer, their weapons aligning, energy building in glowing arcs across their hulls, and she knew this was the moment of ending one way or another, but the human did not falter, his hands steady, his voice calm, his eyes alight with a fire that no empire could extinguish, and as he locked the controls and turned to her, he said, "If this is the end, then let it be one they never forget." She stared at him, her heart breaking and soaring at once, and she reached for his hand, squeezing it as though their souls might fuse in that touch, and whispered, "Then we will end together." And in that instant she was no longer the princess who had waited among ruins, she was no longer the broken remnant of a fallen world, she was his equal, his ally, his hope, and his reason, and together they faced the storm. The blockade opened fire, lances of energy streaking through the sky, but the human ship surged forward, weaving with impossible precision, every bolt that should have struck somehow missing by a breath, every path that should have been closed opening just enough for him to slip through, and she realized with awe that it was not luck. It was him, his will, his refusal to bend, shaping the chaos into a path. The vessel shook, panels sparking, alarms screaming, but still he drove them on, his face set with a determination that burned brighter than any weapon, and for the first time she believed that perhaps they could make it, perhaps even a single ship could defy an empire if its heart was strong enough. Yet the blockade was relentless, more ships moving to encircle, their weapons building toward a final, crushing barrage, and she felt fear rise again. But then she remembered his words, his promise, and she stood, moving to the communications panel, her hands trembling but her voice steady as she spoke into the open channels. Her words carried across the frequencies of war. "I am not dead. I am the princess of a fallen world, and I stand with humanity. You will not silence us. You will not erase us. We are the fire you cannot burn." Her voice echoed through the void, carried to soldiers and slaves, to rebels and broken souls hiding across the galaxy. And she knew even as she spoke that her words were a spark, and sparks could ignite into flame. The enemy ships hesitated only for a moment, but it was enough, because in that moment the human found his opening, driving the ship through a gap in the encirclement, engines roaring as they burst into open space, stars glittering like freedom beyond, and though enemy fire still rained, though their ship shuddered with every strike, they did not stop, they could not stop. Because now they carried not just their own lives but the weight of every soul who had heard her voice and dared to hope. The final barrage came, a storm of fire that should have torn them apart, but the human, with one last impossible maneuver, twisted the ship into a dive, rolling through the flames, the hull scorched, systems failing, yet somehow alive. And when the stars opened before them, vast and endless, the alien princess let out a sob of joy, clinging to him as tears streaked her face, because they had done it, they had broken through, they had defied the ruins and the blockade and the fire, and together they had carved a path into the future. He turned to her then, exhaustion etched into every line of his face, but his eyes still burning, and he whispered, "We're not done." This was only the beginning, and she nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "Then let the galaxy burn with the fire we light." And in that vow, in that union of defiance and hope, they became more than survivors, more than fugitives, they became the spark of a revolution, and the story of a princess who waited among ruins and a human who returned through fire would echo across the stars, not as an ending, but as the beginning of a legend that even empires could not silence.